While many bird species are exploited for food, today we will focus on ducks, chickens, and turkeys. I will be interviewing Lauren about her experiences. Lauren, I know many of us, including myself, have admired you for your long-term commitment to animals. You and I have had many conversations about the terrible things that happen to birds, regardless of species. Could you start us off by telling everyone about what these birds go through and what did you witness firsthand?
Sure. I'll do a quick description of myself. I have short, dark hair. I am of Mexican descent, and I'm wearing a yellow dress, and my pronouns are she, her. I think that one of the things that's consistent across the board when you look at hens who are raised for eggs and ducks who are raised for their flesh, as well as turkeys, is the types of mutilations that take place. That instead of giving some of these animals more room, they take off parts of their body. So, keeping hens in cages for eggs, they cut off the tips of their beaks. Um, Ducks who are raised for their flesh, they have the tips of their bills cut off, and turkeys who are raised for their flesh have the tips of their beaks cut off, as well as their toes, for a variety of reasons, all just so that they can be bred for human consumption. Um, they are typically kept in incredibly crowded conditions, similar to what you see in the videos. And I think that was one of the most striking things about doing investigations on my own was, I went, first saw my animal rights video in 1987 and did my first investigations in maybe 1999. So having the reality of what I saw in those videos being literally what it was that I was investigating. And the investigations are things I never thought I could do when I saw those videos was just like I could never do something like that, but when you have to, you do. And the smells are something that you can never get across um, to people when they're watching these. They can see what's happening, but they can't smell it. They can't inhale the ammonia that's inside that's going to burn your lungs for days. I saw a lot of birds who couldn't stand up, a lot who were sick. And the most precious thing is like how gentle all of these birds are. I mean, their bodies are so small and so tiny, and yet all of this takes place so that people can consume them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That is really hard to hear, um, especially the fact that some people are doing so many terrible things to these animals that are still so gentle, like you said. Speaking of gentle birds, I know you've said that ducks hold a very special place in your heart. Can you tell us about one of your experiences with ducks that particularly stood out to you and what you witnessed while you were investigating that industrial facility or factory farm?
Sure. I mean, ducks, I did the first investigations of duck farms in the US and traveled around the country to get the footage, basically to because I ran a campaign to get grocery stores to stop selling duck meat. And in the process, I liberated, as well as some of my friends, liberated some of these ducks. And one of the things to know about ducks who are raised in the farms is they're raised in very similar situations to chickens who are raised for food. But in addition to the crowded conditions, the fact that they're indoors is that they don't have, ducks need to have enough water to immerse themselves. Otherwise, they can go blind, they can't maintain their body temperature. But what happens in these facilities is they're basically given water through these pipes that just drop water down on them. And so that isn't enough for them to immerse themselves at all. And it's heartbreaking because you'll see the ducklings with their little bills trying to get water, splashing it on themselves, but they can't. So at one point in time, when we liberated some ducklings from a farm in Southern California who still were yellow from their down, they hadn't even had their feathers yet. When we took them from the farm, we realized they didn't know how to drink water. So we couldn't give them a bowl with water because they weren't quite sure what to do with it. And so we actually had water bottles and we popped holes in the top of the plastic and we were able to get them water that way so that they would just look up, kind of like they had in the farm, and be able to get some water. And it wasn't until eventually I was able to get them to a bathtub to where they could fully immerse themselves, that they're able to drink and really, be more in more natural situations.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That is just so sad because these animals in their natural habitat, like you said, would have had access to ample water because that's where they gravitate towards. So, yeah. Um, I know also speaking about other species of birds, many people will have heard about chickens being raised for food. So let's talk about one of your investigations into chicken facilities. What did you expect to see and what did you actually witness?
Well, I saw what I expected to. I would say that one of the differences is realizing that farms, depending on where they're located, can be different. So in California, where the weather is a bit better, they actually had flaps that would open on the sides. But in Georgia, they were completely indoors, and so the ammonia there. I mean, my lungs like burned for a couple days after visiting that one because the ammonia on the flooring. Um, One of the weirdest things is, again, chickens who are raised for meat are killed at about 7 weeks old. So they're babies. They're literally babies. But because of the way that they're bred, when you go into these facilities, their bodies can be quite large, but their voices are still little baby chirps. And it's just so weird to see these big bodies in these little baby chirps. And again, because of the fast rate in which they're bred, their legs can't always hold up their bodies. So there's numerous chickens who have fallen over who can't stand up. And for me, it was really the quantity, the incredible amount of chickens, shed after shed after shed with, tens of thousands of birds in them. And it was just, for me, it was heartbreaking. I thought I could take 100 chickens out of here and nobody would even know. That's how many there are. And in fact, actually, one of the farms when I left, I actually collapsed just at the weight of the thought of how can I help these when there's so many birds? What can we do? So it's overwhelming, on your mind and on your heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just to go back to something that you mentioned before, in case our listeners or people tuning in today are not aware, can you just tell them about the ammonia and where that comes from?
The ammonia comes from the waste from the birds. And what happens is that it's not as if they're cleaning out these sheds every time they go in and they kill all these birds. They're just putting more litter on the top. So you may have, again, 7 weeks is all that they live. So you have more layering of litter being put on the ground instead of cleaning it out. It's just being layered. So the ammonia really builds up and it burns your eyes. And for me, it was my lungs that were burning, but I was in there a short amount of time compared to these little chicks, that who are closer to the ground and who were there for that entire time, how it must burn them. And of course, we know that it does burn the bottoms of their feet as well.
And also, speaking of chickens, I know you've visited some so-called humane cage-free or free-range egg facilities where hens were being raised to lay eggs. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that the reality is that there's no such label. There's no true label of humanely raised or anything like that. And I think it's always important that remember that even if these farms are small, they still engage in some of the exact same practices that the larger so-called factory farms or industrialized size farms, whatever term wants to be used, even though they're small, doesn't mean they're not using the exact same practices. So, they can still be killing the male chicks in the egg industry because they're no use to them. The farm that I went to, which is in Petaluma, California, which used to be known as like the butter and eggs city. And the birds were not in cages, but it was one of those quote unquote cage free facilities, but they were completely enclosed in a shed and they were debeaked. They still had the tips of their beaks cut off. And there were rats, rats chasing after the birds. And this was a so called humane farm where they were actually had the brown eggs, which are considered to be healthier. But this was the situation in this facility. And again, it's just, again, every time you look behind the barn door or whatever, you're going to find this type of suffering and abuse, regardless if it's a small farm or large farm, because this is just part of what it takes to raise and kill animals for food.
Right. Yeah, and these people that have these facilities and are in this business, that's all they see it as. they're putting profit above these individual lives that to
Always.
us are very important. I know related to eggs, one of the lesser known birds that's also abused for their eggs is quail. And you've told me about an investigation into one such facility that particularly stuck with me. Can you share that experience with everyone?
Sure. Another activist and I were trying to collect data and research for a potential piece of legislation to kind of close up a loophole in California law. And it required us to, look out, the lesser thought of birds who were killed for food. And we went what we thought was going to be an office for a company that raised quail. And what we actually walked into was the slaughterhouse of, and again, the slaughterhouse, it doesn't mean that it's big and it's got these conveyor belts. It's where they kill animals. And we were startled, and the two women who worked there were clearly startled as well. And what we saw were, like I tell you before, I go back when I think of it, and it's always really hard. Um, but we saw the women were holding the quail and inserting a device into their anus and electrocuting them. And there were other quail looking down in the cages, and there were a lot of little baby eggs there. So we knew that they were, using these quail for two different purposes. And you just never know what you're going to find. But it's going to be for the non-human animals. It's going to be definitely cruelty and death.
And I will just say thank you so much for going through that and being able to witness it on our behalf and being able to share that with everyone so that, we can really see behind that barn door, as you said before. Um, Another bird species that's abused, particularly around the end of the year in the US, is the turkey. Could you share your experience with liberating one very special turkey?
Yeah, I mean, a friend and I we always would go by and investigate the slaughterhouses. And this was a Foster Farm slaughterhouse in Central California. And we drove by just to see if there were any animals, see what was going on. And we saw this turkey running around at the slaughterhouse. It was already, they were done doing the killing, but there was no human there. But there was this turkey running around, and turkeys are incredibly curious animals. And there was this door, kind of like to the office, and it was one of those doors that was reflective. So she was literally looking at herself and pecking at the door. And we knew we had to go get her. My friend was like, well, we have to get her. And I was like, shoot, yeah, we do. And so my friend hopped over the fence and was running around after her because, she was a turkey. She didn't know what she was doing. And so eventually I threw over my sweatshirt, and she grabbed my sweatshirt, which she threw over the turkey. And the most interesting part of this story is the fact that she actually lifted the turkey. And if y'all don't know me, but I'm not even 5 feet tall. And I had to stretch my body as much as I could to get the turkey back over the fence. And I thought, even if I have to rip myself in half, I'm going to get this turkey. And we did it right where the sign said no trespassing. So we got this bird and we took off. I could have sworn there was a security guard, and we were like, we're driving. If we have to get to Mexico, we are not letting him take this bird back. We ended up naming her Taylor. And Taylor probably went through something that most of our minds, at least my mind, literally does not want to comprehend. She was covered in blood because more than likely she fell when they hung her upside down and fell into the blood of all the other turkeys. And she ran away. And her toes were cut so far down that she could barely stand up, and her beak was cut so far down she could barely eat. But we were able to get her to a sanctuary, who had to work really hard to get the blood off of her because it had caked on. But it's just what these animals go through. And Taylor's no longer with us, but she sure meant everything to us to know that we were able to get her out of there, especially the unimaginable trauma, not even just physical pain, but the trauma of seeing all the other turkeys being killed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing these experiences. I know it's sometimes hard to go back, but at least in the case of Taylor, you know that what you did for her was her best possible outcome at that point. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
doing that. Um, can you share one thing that may have surprised you about these birds, about the individuals?
Yeah, I think it's just how much they kept their personalities. I mean, even in one of the worst sheds that I investigated of turkeys, where the turkeys were shivering, like literally physically shivering, because they were not doing well. Um, when I would go down to take pictures and video, they were still poking in at my camera. I still had pictures of their little beaks trying to look in at my camera because they are such curious animals. And even in that, you know, that their personality shone through. And I think that's what stuck out to me. And that's for a lot of the animals, even the pig farms that I investigated, that the pigs, when they had enough room, would literally run like little dogs, even though they couldn't run very far and their ears would flap up, that their personalities were still something that couldn't be taken away from them.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. And like you said before, just the fact that despite everything that's going on around them, and these are smart animals, they probably knew what was going to happen based on what they were seeing or hearing. The fact that they were still able to keep their personalities, I think, is just so amazing. Um, Thank you for sharing your insights and your experiences with everyone, Lauren. I really appreciate you and all that you do every day at Food Empowerment Project. And I know that I speak on behalf of the whole team and they feel this way too. So
And
thank
we
you.
feel the same about you. So thank you.
Thank you.